My name is Frank Bewley. I was born in Hammersmith in London on the 25th of May 1931. I joined the Royal Navy in the 7th of December 1948 as a volunteer. So I went to Korea as a volunteer rather than a national serviceman. I was already in the services.
Why did you? Hammersmith isn't well known for being a sea nation. Why did you have a calling for the Navy?
Well, during the war, when I was at school, I wanted to go to the School of Engineering and Navigation at Poplar, but it was evacuated down to the West Country. So that was my ambition, to join the merchant marine as on the engineering or the officer side. But when my dad returned from the Second World War from Burma, he refused to let me be evacuated again, even though it was after the war, to the school which was somewhere down in Devon.
Okay.
So I waited until I was 17 and a quarter and then volunteered for the Fleet Air Arm, wanting to do a trade then. I'd picked aviation.
Wow.
So that's what happened.
And when you were obviously you were in London for the war, for the Blitz.
No, I was evacuated to Cornwall most of the time, and then just before the flying bombs started, the V1s, I returned to London, back to my original school, and then carried on schooling at Addison Garden School at what is that? Shepherd's Bush.
Do you think that had you been to the coast before the war?
Only for holidays, but I did like Cornwall because initially, while I was at work, I went down and worked for 6 months on the fishing boats out of Newlyn from where I was evacuated to Penzance. I went on the boat there, but it's very hard life.
Yeah. But that sort of, you got a taste for the sea, I think.
Taste of the sea, yes.
Okay. And when you were being schooled, and obviously you had some... Did you ever know about this place called Korea?
No, I've really never heard of Korea at all.
Even though your father had been to Burma, had been in the Far East?
No, I was well read too about Malaya, Singapore, Indonesia, but Korea didn't. It's only reading old Second World War books about the Japanese occupation of the China area that I realised they had Korea first. But the more you read about Korea, the more you realise they used the Koreans for really low labourers. They had a terrible life. They used them for most of the menial tasks that the Japs wanted doing. They used the Koreans. Well, plus they must have used Chinese, but so that's the only way I knew that they had occupied the Korean Peninsula. I didn't realise how they split it up after the Second World War. This again was because Russia had gone into Japan towards the end of the war when they weren't anywhere near it. Then they went in there and caused havoc at the end, when they then had to decide with like General MacArthur and that, who was going to have which on the peninsula.
Let's move to your volunteering to the Fleet Air Arm, and some of the early things that you got up to pre-Korea.
Well, before the Korean War, I was based on a squadron at Royal Naval Air Station at Calderose, and we had various aircraft, and they were trying things to go ahead. For instance, they had a Vampire, which is a jet aircraft, and they were trying to land on the carriers with no undercarriage. So we had rubber under the fuselage, and a chap called Commander Brown, who recently has been on the news and has recently died, very famous flyer. He was the commander of the squadron that we had there, and they tried all these things on the carriers, which it didn't work, but I mean they did try and make aircraft lighter by having no undercarriage. So it used to land on, come back to the airfield, and then put the wheels down in the normal way.
Wow.
And they had Seahawks, Attacker, which were other jet aircraft. So I was before I went to Korea, I was mainly working on the jet aircraft, whereas in the Korean War, because they wanted all the American aircraft that were jets were very, very short period over the front line. So they wanted piston aircraft, so they would have longer over the front line. They'll hover, they get called in and then go into the attack to ground support the troops. So the squadron that we formed in May 1952 were old Second World War type Firefly 5s, which had a pilot and a observer in the back. So that was our squadron. The other squadron that was going was 801 Squadron with the Sea Fury aircraft, again a fighter to give cover when you were doing the attacks. So we formed up at RAF Royal Naval Air Station at Macquarie-Hannish, which was on the Mulligan Tyre, in the May. Then,
and I mean, obviously the war broke out in 50. You're working on aircraft that... which aircraft carrier are you on? Are you on the Glory then?
No. Right up until 1952, I was either at the Royal Naval Air Station at Caldrose or at the Royal Naval Air Station at St Mirren near Padstow. Again, both had naval squadrons. When they weren't on the ships, they were with us on shore, and we did ordinary servicing, training the pilots for the various roles.
Did you have a preference for St Mirren?
I liked to be in Cornwall. It was lovely because Padstow was nice. You could go out or to Newquay or Padstow. A nice area. I did like Cornwall, and the locals were very friendly to the Navy. They were if you went out at the weekends, they looked after you.
You go down to Padstow?
Well, I used to go to Padstow, or I'd go on a chap used to take me on a motorbike down to Penzance, because I kept in touch with the people I'd been evacuated.
When did you first know that Korea had happened then?
Well, obviously we used to get the naval news, and in the 50s you had I think it was either HMS Theseus was already out in the Far East, but it only had Seafires and I don't know what the other aircraft. I think they did have Firefly 4s, really old Second World War aircraft. So initially that HMS Triumph was probably the first carrier that went out there. The other carrier that was there was like a double-decker carrier called HMS Unicorn, which was a maintenance carrier, and they used to use that to service the aircraft, to take them backwards and forwards between Japan and Singapore, where most of the naval people were based at RAF Sembawang at Singapore. But you got the news. You got very little in the newspapers about Korea at all. Most of it had to come via service sources. People came back and said what it was like.
What do you remember of being told that you were going to move from a land base to an aircraft carrier?
Well, you regularly went on the carrier for small, short sessions to do tests or trials with certain aircraft. I mean, the aircraft, the carrier used to steam off the shore near Falmouth, and the aircraft took off from Caldrose and then landed on, and we went out on small boats and then joined the carrier. I went off for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, then came back to base again. And the other thing they did at Cordros, of course, was the observer training place. So they had the helicopters. So all the destroyers had choppers on board. And again, they would come back ashore while the ship was in harbour, and then that's the routine of the Fleet Aeron at that time.
Yeah. Oh,
But they didn't send you to war situations until you were age 21. So you mainly were in areas adjacent to either air stations around the British Isles, like Eglinton in Northern Ireland or up in Scotland. You could be on a ship, but you wouldn't be in operational waters.
When did you know that you were going to join the Glory and become a member of its crew, as it were?
Well, during April, I suddenly got a message on the...
April. Which year, sorry? April.
Oh, it's 1952. As I say, I'd only just got married to my first wife in April, and then suddenly on the notice board, pinned up, you've been posted to 821 Squadron, which for Korean preparation for Korean service later in the year. We didn't actually know what date we were going to arrive in Korea. And we didn't know that we were actually going to relieve HMS Ocean, which was the ship that was already out there operating. But that eventually we came to be known that we got until May till November when we were aimed to be on operations in Korea to get organised, trained, both for the ground staff and for the aircrew to learn to operate as a war on a war footing.
Right, okay. And had you been on the Glory before? Had the Glory been...
No, I hadn't. Never been on the Glory. I'd been on HMS Illustrious, I've been on Victorious, Indomitable, all the various carriers.
How did the Glory compare?
Well, it's a light fleet carrier, much smaller than the big fleet carriers. Much more friendly because you knew more people. It wasn't so large. But there again, it tended to roll. I was always, once I left harbour on HMS Glory, I was always seasick at first, every time. I never got used to it.
Yeah, and the Glory had a great history, didn't it? Because it was where the peacekeeping was signed, wasn't it? HMS
Yes,
Glory,
yeah, that they had that over in Japan, that's right.
So that was nice.
And that did all the repatriation runs from people that were released from Japan. They put more bunks in the aircraft hangars and they shipped them out. They used that carrier to go to Canada and various places, taking back the people that had been prisoners of war.
It was still a relatively new carrier as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't made till the latter part of the war.
Yeah. And okay, so you just touched on it. It was a friendlier thing. Just give me some idea of the layout and the areas that you worked on board.
Well, you mainly operate either in the hangar deck or on the deck itself, out in the open, unfortunately. If you had work that was mainly over 4 hours, like you were going to do an engine change or something on the wings, wheel changes or something, then you'd have to go down into the hangar. There's no way you could do that, something on jacks on the flight deck. But all the refuelling and stuff had to be done on the flight deck, of course, out in the open with all the fire precautions that there are. And unfortunately, some of those things have to be done in inclement weather, when it's raining or snowing, because in the Korean operations we actually had snow and on deck. But you do learn to do the things you can down in the hangar as much as you could.
And how many were you operating out of a mess?
Each squadron had different mess decks, which were down well below decks, where the whole group of maybe 14 people had one. Well, I've got the picture on there. You can see. What you have one mess deck table with two seats and a wall cupboard which had all your pots and pans, cups, saucers, and everything you had to go away and collect from the canteen in trays and walk back with it back to the mess deck and then dish it out to each other. And then of course you had to wash up all your pots and pans.
And how many men in your mess?
Well, I say there was between 12 and 14.
And you were all engineers, were you?
They were all engineers, either airframes, engines, radio, quite all the different aircraft trades.
So would each mess be the different trades, or were you all mixed?
No,
messes?
no. For instance, all the engine room staff from the actual ship were in different mess decks. You were split. So the fleet air arm people were messed completely separate from the stokers and various sea trades.
Do you know how many Fleet Air Arms crew there were on the Glory?
About 600 or 700.
Wow.
Yeah, it's still quite large, but not as many as like later on I went on HMS Ark Royal, which was as opposed to a 17,000, 18,000 ton carrier to a 60,000 ton carrier.
Yeah.
Much more facilities, and they had proper mess decks. You ate in the proper meal rooms, but not on a light fleet carrier.
Okay, good.
Because don't forget, we had to use hammocks. You didn't have bunks like they do now. Everyone had a hammock. Terribly uncomfortable things to sleep in. I don't like them.
You never got used to them?
No, don't like you. Well, the body's the wrong shape. It's a complete curve. Terribly uncomfortable thing.
Yeah. I've met many a sailor who didn't mind a hammock.
No, I even had camp beds in the hangar. I'd rather sleep in the hangar, but it was a bit drafty because they invariably had the front and rear lift slightly down to allow the air to come through, and it'd be a bit drafty. And of course the deck's vibrating, steel deck all the time, but at least you had a comfortable bed to lay on. Okay,
so let's talk a bit about setting sail, leaving your wife. When was that, and did you have any emotion about it, or was it just exciting?
Well, yeah, it was. I was looking forward to the first time going abroad. Of course, I was looking forward to it. I did. It was a bit of a shock to get it so quickly after just getting married to my first wife. But there you are. We had no children, obviously, and it was going to be an adventure.
And just describe the adventure of getting over to the.
Well, then, we then, as I say, we went to Magri-Hanish and we started to train there until we eventually joined the ship to head out to eventually to How Far. But of course, on the way we did various trips. Like one of the things we visited Spain. HMS Glory was the first Royal Navy ship to go during Franco's time, and we berthed alongside Barcelona and let the Spanish come on board and have a look around the ship, wander around, look at the aircraft. It was quite an adventure for us and them, because you only read about Spain in the newspapers, but it was odd because when you walked in Barcelona, all on street corners you'd see armed police and soldiers, because Franco's time they were very still militaristic, and quite a shock really.
Yeah, amazing what's happening there now.
But then we pushed on then to Hull Far and went ashore to Royal Naval Air Station at Hull Far. It was quite a happy time in Malta really. We did lots of flying there off the Hull Far. The ship was in the harbour all the time, and we used to go down to a place called Marsus Locks, which is the southern end of Malta, where we'd do sailing, swimming. I learned to swim there, funny enough. I never ever learnt to swim earlier, but I did learn to swim while I was at Malta.
So in terms of, obviously when you'd been with, doing your Fleet Air Arm work before, it was a lot of experimental work, whereas now, was there a change in the sort of work, what you're doing?
Well, you're doing permanent work on one type of aircraft, and you had your own aircraft allocated, because we were what they called a pilot's mate. A pilot's mate, instead of having just airframes, one trade, you had to do 6 trades, up to 4 hours work. So we previously gone back to the Royal Naval Air Station at Yeovilton and learnt the other trades, passed some exams, did it back at the aerodrome and passed the exam that you were efficient at it. So then by the time you went on to the operational squadron, you had one pilot, one observer on the Firefly, and one pilot's mate, who that was his aircraft. His name was painted on it.
And is it in Halfa where you were assigned your aircraft, or before that?
No, I got my aircraft at Machrihanish. Yes. You all the way through then, my aircraft was my aircraft.
And who was your pilot, and who was your...
Lieutenant Barrett was my pilot mostly. I mean, sometimes, obviously, when 4 aircraft go up, when they come back, they've got to be serviced, so 4 others. So even though they might have their name on one aircraft, if it's being serviced, they can't use that. But that was your sole responsibility.
And what was your relationship like, when you met your pilot for the first time?
You're very close with the pilot, because he obviously tells you little things, little niggling things that are on the aircraft that he wants fixing, or they don't actually make the aircraft fully unserviceable. It can't fly, but he'll have a word with you and say, "Can you do so and so?"
And what about the observer?
Well, you didn't seem to come into contact with them much, as again, they weren't. They were mainly when they were going on operations.
Did you mix with them?
Not really, no. And you didn't do, when we did sport, you didn't do sport with the officers. I did a little bit, because we had sailing, 2 small sailing boats on the ship, and I used to take them sailing. Sometimes when we were in harbour, I'd get the boat and borrow it and go sailing in Valletta or Marsus Locks.
And
so then you might be sailing, you could go sailing with an officer. But they kept well clear of you.
Even though you've got this really tight dynamic?
No, there's them and us, really. Even when you went ashore. More so when you got to Japan, because you were either at Sasebo, which was the American naval base, or you went to Curie, which was the Commonwealth, where all the Australians and Brits were in Japan. And of course, Hiroshima was only 7 miles away from Curie.
Did you go to Hiroshima?
Yes.
What was it like?
Quite a shock. It was only 7 years after it had been dropped.
Still devastated?
Yes. Well, you really shouldn't have gone. You didn't know that you could still get all the radiation there, did you? I mean, we should never have really gone for a wander, really.
Anti-guerrilla operations near the Suez or Aden.
Well, when we went through on the way to Korea, we first stopped at Aden. We went through the Suez Canal when all the guns on the ship were manned because there were still terrorists operating each side of the Suez Canal. So the ships went to operations, action stations, and they manned the small guns along the side of the ship. And we went through the canal first to a place called Port Suez, which is halfway down. And then we headed to Aden. Well, again, we anchored there and went ashore for a while. We did sport then with the RAF and the services that were there based at Aden. But the aircraft, once we put out to sea again, did operations with the terrorists in the hills in Aden. And then we moved on then down to Malacca Straits off Malaya when we got an army officer fly on board by helicopter who liaised with us when they did operations then against the Chinese guerrillas in Malaysia. And eventually we then steamed up and down for a few days doing that until they released us and we went straight into more in Singapore. So we had shore leave then in Singapore.
Okay.
Happy time. Nice, like Singapore.
Yeah. All right, let's move from Singapore. You go to Hong Kong, you prepare for operation, and then let's get us over to the Yellow Sea.
Yes, we moved straight to Hong Kong then, where we met HMS Ocean, and they swapped the aircraft that they had serviceable. We took them on board as spares.
How many aircraft on board?
About 30, 40.
Fully crewed or some spare?
Well, some are spared, yes.
Okay.
I mean,
pretty full hangars though when you get.
Yes.
30 or 40
Well, you
ships.
see, you can take a picture of the. It shows you one squadron set of officers, which give you an idea of what's on board ship. And of course, some had already been to Korea, and some of those weren't going home on HMS Ocean because she was returning to the Med. And they came on board us then to continue with their operations and topped up our air crews. And eventually we got the dates there when we eventually arrived at either Sasebo or Curie. What did we? I forgot which one we arrived at. One or the other, Sasebo probably.
Sasebo, yeah.
Yes.
6th of November.
Yes. So that's.
And then on the 10th, you went into the Korean War Theatre.
Yeah, that's when we started, and then we alternated with a ship called the Bedoin Straits, which was a United States Marine flying carrier, a small carrier like us again, only a light fleet type size, again with piston engines aircraft. They had Corsairs and that type of aircraft on board. Again, piston engines, so they get all the main jet aircraft of the Americans was all on the East Coast, up the East Coast, the bigger carriers, fleet carriers. Yes.
Did you have a lot to do with the other Commonwealth navies then?
Yes, because all the time we operated, we had 2 or 3 destroyers or frigates, which may have been Dutch, they may have been Australian, they may have been English.
Was there much, did you get on board much? Was there much mixing?
Well, only when you were ashore then, either at Curie or at Sasebo. Again, because we did sport. We always played football and football or rugby. They certainly didn't play cricket out there.
Okay.
And you did boxing matches and things like that, all the usual things. Some of the pilots went ashore with the army to get an idea what it was like ashore. They'd fly them ashore on a helicopter to do maybe a week with someone else. Instead of coming back to Japan, they went ashore.
Into Korea?
Yes, so they get an idea what was going on. But of course we didn't do that.
That's quite useful.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And so just talk me through a sort of a standard day then on that first tour before you came back to Portsmouth.
Well, obviously before you'd leave for Korea then, you were fully, all your fresh vegetables, all the open area decks on the carrier were full of vegetables. They'd stow it out in the open on any deck that was open to the sea. You'd had potatoes and all that had been loaded when we were ashore in Japan, fresh vegetables and stuff. But also we would have loaded up with bombs, ammunition, aviation fuel and stuff like that. Because sometimes when we were ashore, we would refuel smaller ships from our carrier. They'd steam alongside us, we'd put lines out, steam them all in line and keep topping them up with fuel. So we were then ready, the aircraft were all fully serviceable, and then on the way they would start doing flying operations as soon as you got away from Japan, heading in.
In the Second World War, the carriers used to have to sail into wind because they were slow.
Well, we still did that. No, you've got to have wind over the deck. So they're doing at least 15, 20 knots maybe.
Are they catapulted off?
Well, we do free flight as well, but catapult, yes. Yes. We only had one catapult, see, on a light fleet carrier. Yes. In harbour a couple of times when we were stationary, we did aircraft took off using what they call J-Dog, 2 rockets clamped under the wings, and they'd rev the engines up full and then fire their J-Dog and shoot the... Bit dodgy, really.
Dodgy if it didn't work.
But,
yeah.
but that's what you'd eventually do. And operations started usually around about 5 to 7 in the morning. So we were up at 5 in the morning, out on your aircraft, clean the windows, make sure all the canopies were clean for the pilot. And if your aircraft was ranged on deck, of course, you were out in the open. And you do all your checks to make sure everything is right. And then...
What checks were you running on a Firefly? What pre-flight checks are you running?
Well, while we would try all the controls, you'd make sure you have oxygen and stuff all topped up. You'd make sure all your oils were chopped up. And there was no visible signs of oil leaks, because the Firefly, of course, is liquid cooled. So you got coolant. Whereas the other squadron, the Sea Furies, they were air cooled, a big radial engine. Ours was a big inline Griffin, like the old Merlin engines. So all those things were critical. That was all topped up, no leaks. You try your hydraulics. You couldn't try your undercarriage because it was down. So the only thing you could do was to make sure that everything was running. Occasionally we would start the engines up, and I could do that. We would go in, prime the engine, start it, and you'd warm the engine up because you're all ranged down the back end of the flight deck. Sometimes you were actually pushed out over the sea on girders that put the 3 wheels, tail wheel, and then put the clamps on then, and you'd be out of the way so they could clear the other aircraft. But mostly you were on deck with the cables attached to the undercarriage to hold you down and stationary while obviously the ship's rolling somewhat, sometimes more than others.
Are you doing the armament?
No, we have armourer. They have armourers, and we assisted those. I've got some pictures there where, while we were in harbour, we helped them load 20mm ammunition, keep putting the rounds into belts to go on board ship. As you'll notice, in one of those flights that we had a problem where we were using old 20mm ammunition from the Second World War, and it was exploding in the wings, and we lost an aircraft, which I've listed in there.
And what was it like to lose an aircraft on board? How did it affect morale before you lost your pilot?
Well, it's weird really, because you get used to the same pilot. You come out and you'd see him in and strap him in, and you'd see him fly away, come back, he'd be all smiles. You know, you could see relief on their faces when they clambered out. They'd be all sweating, pull their helmets off, and they'd be beaming smiles, you know, because it must have been terrible. You notice they were all full of sweat because some of the flight gear that they had on, and they had to wear a wetsuit because if they crashed in the sea in Korea, you wouldn't last minutes unless they were picked up. So they had these horrible wetsuits, real clammy, over the top of their flying suits in case they did ditch into the water. But of course, if it was the other squadron that had lost an aircraft, you didn't quite get the feeling again it was your squadron. But then, of course, you used to have a service, regular services on board, and at one of those, and then we would all range and say prayers, and you know.
Burial at sea.
Well, he didn't come back. See, we didn't. We never had anyone return that was dead. They'd all either been shot down, crashed, lost, external to the ship. So we never actually got a body.
So let me just. So you arrived in Korea in what did we say? We said, and you had 4, 5, 6, nearly 7 weeks of flying every day, pretty much, with your pilot and your observer. Just talk a bit about the build-up to. Well, talk about Christmas Day. Was it Christmas Day when he?
Well, we were on an operational tour on Christmas Day, so we didn't have any Christmas dinner, and it was in Christmas Day when my aircraft went up. The aircraft had taken off. The first flights were again at 7 o'clock, and the last were 7 in the evening. And 4 Fireflies had gone up, plus 4 Sea Furies, and they went to do attacks ashore. And Lieutenant Barrett, they were doing shallow dives on either troop movements or something ashore, and he went into a dive and never pulled out, dived straight into the ground and exploded. So whether he was hit by flak, because lots of aircraft that we lost were due to light flak. They'd fire anything at the aircraft, and being coolant, you only had to have 1 bullet on a coolant, and your engine stopped, and down you came.
How did you know that he went into this light dive? Had somebody reported back from the other?
Oh well, the other aircrew. That was the report, and that's in the logged in both the books that I've got there. reporting it.
I mean, forgive me for asking, but if there's a suggestion that the plane didn't pull up, is there some sort of inquiry about that? Because potentially that's
No, they don't, and they don't have, like over here. If you have a crash like that, they have an inquiry and then have an inquest. But while you're on operations, there's nothing like that.
And when did you realise that something was amiss? I mean, just remind.
Well, they just didn't return to the ship when they were due back. You all go up on deck and wait because you like to watch. We always watch the aircraft land on, because invariably you got deck landings that didn't go right. You could get a crash, see, because if they didn't pick a wire up, it could bounce, miss the first wire, and then carried on missing the wires. Right across the flight deck, halfway down, was a big wire barrier. So it was going to fly into that, bend the propeller or do quite a bit of damage, but it would stop. And I say, we always watch the aircraft land on or take off. You keep it well out of the way, obviously, but we always watch them return. And then, of course, you notice, well, that's one, that's two, three, no more.
And then you realise that it's your...
Well, you realise then something's gone wrong. Some didn't return to the ship, but where we operated off the northwest coast, right up near the 38th parallel, was an island called Pyangdo, and it was hard sand, and they'd land on the beach on this island, and it had got a South Korean, what are they called, special forces on it, and the Americans were there. They had choppers and used it to pick up their air crew. Well, they used to land there, and sometimes we'd go over there and service an aircraft so that it could take off again off the sand and fly back to the beach. But if it couldn't fly again, our servicing ships used to pick the aircraft up and they'd take them back to Japan, and we didn't pick them up until we went back to Japan again.
So your first instinct is, if it's not coming back, if you see three coming back, you think, oh,
We've got a problem, yes.
Or it might be landing up at thing.
Exactly, yeah. But then very quickly the ship would have known, and the buzz would spread, what we call the buzz, the chatter. Officers would tell the chiefs and chief petty officers, and they'd tell us, I think we've lost an aircraft, and then you'd wait, and then it was confirmed. They make an announcement over the tannoy. Unfortunate, we've lost 2 aircraft, because you did not only lose ours, sometimes it was just the Sea Furies.
And how did you feel when you found out that you'd lost your pilot then?
Well, you just feel lost, because what am I going to work on now? That's my aircraft gone now. You feel a bit lost. It's weird, really. You really, and then you know his story. I knew he was a bank manager in Liverpool, and he'd been called up to come to Korea. He'd gone right through the Second World War, and then got called back in because he was what they call a Z-man, which was a reservist from the Second World War. And there he was, gone. Very, very sorry thing.
It must take a while to get over that.
Yeah, so you'll see with that list, I've got a listing there of the dates and sub-lieutenants and lieutenants, each one that's... some were shot down, I say some just did various things and didn't dive down and just didn't come up. And they don't know whether they were hit or whether they had blacked out or something, because you could have accidents in the sky. It didn't have to be against operations.
Why did you paint pictures on the aircraft?
Well, that's a tradition with aircraft, especially from the Second World War, when all the American aircraft and the Brits used to paint it on the sides. So there's a series of pictures there, each aircraft.
Who decides what it's going to be?
Well, just having a chat to the suggestion to the pilot, showing some diagrams. Yeah.
And then he says, yeah, and you paint it?
We paint it on, yeah. You can see there, unusually, one of the aircraft they brought back from Korea is in the Fleet Air Arm Museum. And on there is our Lieutenant Commander Gardner, our CO, the pilot, and then it's got Wally Pinn, leading airman pilot's mate, like me, and the observer's name. But you'll see by the picture I've got there that I'm down listed as his fitter as well. So it's got leading airman pilot's mate Bewley, and you can see on the pictures. So I've clearly got of that aircraft with the United Nations sign and a black leopard diving onto the ground. And then all the bombs and rocket markings, each operation we paint them on the side.
I look forward to seeing that. You're in the Yellow Sea, you're in, you're in the tropics, although it was cold. You had typhoons and you had freezing weather. Just talk a bit about how the weather affected you. You know, you touched on it earlier in terms of both big seas, the big winds, the cold.
Very difficult to do servicing of aircraft because you have to clamp them down under the undercarriage and the tail wheels and onto the wingtips and secure them to ring bolts in the flight deck or into the, if you were down in the hangar deck. You had to always secure the aircraft. You couldn't have it free standing. It was always clamped. A bit difficult when you wanted to do, say, you had a problem with the undercarriage, you would have to jack the aircraft up. So you would jack it up, then while it was jacked up, you'd then put all the clamps back to hold the aircraft secure to do the servicing. But whatever the weather was, if your aircraft was out in the open, say it was pouring rain, and you've got to still do all your checks, try go around and try the control surfaces, check the wheels, tyres, make sure there were no still pumped up, all the pressures were right.
Could you always fly?
Could you always?
Could the aircraft always fly? When were the conditions that they couldn't fly?
Well, if the deck was if we were in too rough a sea, then they keep them clamped.
Were you in typhoon?
No, we never had typhoon. The most we had was -16, a temperature of -16 when it was, this flight deck was snow, covered with snow, which we had to clear sometimes so the aircraft could take off.
So the aircraft would still take off?
They'd still take off.
Oh. That mustn't have been fun for the pilot.
Yeah, well there you are, and slippery on the deck for us, especially if it's rolling. Yeah.
Did many aircraft not make the landing and go overboard?
I could show you pictures of that, but I've got some pictures of crashes, and you'll see when they didn't catch the wire. So they come down and bounced, then the hook's hanging at the back on the tail wheel. If it misses the wire, and then there's a series of them, they're about that much apart, big wires, and they're just slightly raised off the deck about that much, and then the hook's got to catch that and stop him almost stone dead. It pulls out, it's on a hydraulic. But if they miss that, then they'll hit the barrier. Invariably, it would stay down most of the time, but smash the propeller because it would tangle in the wire, and you'd be up for a propeller change and an engine change because the engine would be shocked. So you're up for an engine change and at least a propeller change.
How long did it take to change an engine in a propeller?
We do one, well, a propeller you could change in about 5 to 6 hours. Engine, 4 or 5 hours, we could get an engine out.
Wow, so it's quicker to do the engine than the propeller?
Well, yeah, you could, most of it's all on quick release stuff, and you can then hoist the engine right out. Yes.
Yeah, amazing.
They've only got to take the spinner off, and there's maybe 3 or 4 bolts to take the propeller off.
Oh, you said 5 to 6 hours for the propeller.
Well, sometimes you got the problem of lining it up. It's setting it up, really.
Yeah.
You might pull it off and on quickly, but the engine is mainly all the oil fittings and things like that.
Okay. What about the loss of this helicopter and crew? What happened there?
Well, that was in Hong Kong harbour when we got into Hong Kong before we passed over. When we were taken over from HMS Ocean, the helicopter, the tail rotor hit the forward of the where the captain sat. You know, the island on the ship is on to the right hand side, halfway down the flight deck. Right in front of that, there was always a crane, which is used to lift the aircraft. And that, of course, has got a jib that sticks up. And the chopper came in, was up taking pictures of us entering harbour, all lined up. And it came in, and the tail rotor hit the boom of the crane. And if you lose a tail rotor, a helicopter, the engine's going to try and turn a whole lot. It just starts to descend. Everything flies off.
Horrible to see.
They're not going to get out.
Did you see that?
Well, yeah, we were lined up on the flight deck. Straight into the Hong Kong harbour.
And they died?
Oh, died, yeah, drowned. Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, look, there's lots and lots of different sorties and stuff, but it's all very much of a...
No, they're all of a similar nature. You're quite right.
Tell me a bit about the coronation of Queen Mary, or the death of Queen Mary. What happened there?
Yeah, she died, and then we were at Curie, and we lined up. The actual jetty was a Second World War battleship, a Japanese battleship, which they were using as a jetty. All the top structure had been taken off. So the actual thing, we were all lined up in between the two ships. And one side was HMS Glory, and then on the left-hand side was HMS Unicorn, which was this repair carrier that used to go backwards and forwards between Singapore, Hong Kong and Japan to give you all the new aircraft or repair aircraft. So, and they did this full service for Queen Mary. Very good. Just sing the normal hymns, you know, and they...
After your pilot has gone, what are you just given another pilot, or what happens next?
Well, normally you'd be reallocated onto another aircraft, or you'd back someone else up. You'd have 2 of you would go onto an aircraft, so to make it quicker to do tasks. or you would wait until you went back to Japan and there you get another aircraft, you see. And then you get another pilot. But for some reason they wanted someone from each squadron to join the people that were in the aircraft control room to do all the... Each aircraft has a book which controls the servicing of the aircraft. And it's called an A700. But that, everything you do, all the engine changes are recorded, you sign for it. It's a fully documented piece. And those are all held in the aircraft control room. And the pilot, first, when he goes in to pick his aircraft up, he goes in the aircraft control room. They tell him which aircraft he's got. He then looks at that book and sees it's all signed up and it's been signed by us and serviceable. And he signs and accepts the aircraft. He might go out and have a wander around first and then come back in. And that's what the aircraft control room does. There's a diagram of the flight deck with all the aircraft range with all the numbers on, and with little dockets where we put the pilots' names.
So it's almost like an aircraft movement place.
It is, yes. And I say, it's got all the documentation.
But it was a bit
And
warmer than the deck.
Well, it is. It's right inside, and there's a little tiny window, a triangular window that sticks out onto the flight deck that you can look left and right without going on the deck. So you could see what's happening on the deck. And I was very happy to get in. It was quite a good job then. And I stayed in there then with... There was a chief petty officer, an engineer in charge in there, and myself from 821 Squadron and another chap from the Sea Fury Squadron. And then we both looked after each aircraft's paperwork. But I also wrote the aircraft logs. We had a logbook, which I did copper plate. So I wrote the squadron line books in my handwriting, which is now in the Fleet Aero Museum. Yeah.
Have you seen that?
I haven't, no.
Oh.
I say, and I was annoyed to go, after having that picture there, where my name's on that aircraft that's in the... I mean, it's obviously not the same aircraft. They've used one they returned from Australia that came off HMAS Sydney from Korea, and they paid to bring it back to UK and they made it flyable, and that's now in the Fleet Aero Museum at Yeovilton. But they've painted it to simulate aircraft 200, the CO's aircraft from the Korean War. I never really knew what hardships we used to call them pongos. The armies to us were called pongos. What if they were the same as us, the foul weather gear that the British had in Korea was totally inadequate. And the army chaps used to get stuff from the Americans.
And what was your winter gear like?
Very, very poor. Not adequate. It wasn't designed for that activity at all. Very poor.
And how did you feel about leaving Korea then? How did you feel when the ship was so becoming?
Oh well, very relieved. We wanted to get home. I mean, it's such a busy life when you're actually doing flying operations. It's everything's going at full swing. As I say, if you don't finish flying at 7 in the evening when the last aircraft lands on, you've got to go in there then and do any little jobs so that it's ready for first thing in the morning. So you may not get to bed until very late in the evening. And then you've got to have eaten. And invariably you just piled in. You didn't undress or anything. You got straight into the hammock or a couple of us, the two seats that were alongside the table, someone's actually slept on there. I definitely didn't like the hammock at all.
So yeah, literally you could turn in at 12 and be up at 5.
That's right. You've got to be up early in the morning. You get the call, and then you'd hear the pipe to flying stations all over the ship. So you'd know when because that's to warn people not to walk on the flight deck. You've got to keep well clear of the aircraft.
What was the pipe noise? Do you know? What was it? Just a single blast or several?
Yeah, it was like a klaxon noise. Klaxon.
Okay, and
Mind you, they still use flags, oddly. If you went out onto the flight deck, they'd pull the flag up when they were in flying operations. We were from the olden days.
yeah,
As a flag that actually shows when there's, mind you, other ships then can see that you've got flying operations on. They know what the flag was. Quite good. But when we were coming home, that was most unusual. When we got to Singapore, we'd offloaded all our serviceable aircraft before we'd left. But when we got to Singapore, lots of the Army and Air Force were coming home on our ship. They came on board and they got accommodation for them. But on the deck, we had cars and lorries they loaded on the tail end of the deck, right in the open, and in the hangar, we had stuff that was coming back to UK. And of course, the ship had been out in the Far East and the Middle East for well over a year, so the sides of the ship were so rusty. When we actually got to Hong Kong, back from Japan first, one side of the ship that was going to dock in Malta was painted by the ladies in Hong Kong. There's the ladies that do all the painting. And they come alongside the ship and painted quickly over the one side of the HMS Glory. And when we went into Grand Harbour, that was the side that the ship pulled in. So it still looked pretty clean. Whereas all the other side was rust, red rust,
wow.
shambles looking. But of course, on the deck, we've got all these army lorries, there was no aircraft. We still lined the deck in our white uniforms, of course, to enter harbour every time. And then when we've eventually we went to Gibraltar then, when we went ashore for a couple of days and anchored there, and bit of shore leave. And then we got to Portsmouth and moored, and our families were waiting on the jetty at Malta, at Portsmouth, down at South Sea.
Well, that's nice. You had a bit of a homecoming, because a lot of troops, it was...
No.
Where have you been?
No, and within hours of docking there, we were off. And the squadrons, I mean, lots of the seamen couldn't do that. We had no aircraft on board, so there's no reason to hold us. We had nothing to work on. So as soon as we docked in Portsmouth Harbour, the families came on board and we showed them around, and then we were issued with our leave passes, and all our equipment and stuff was in the hangar, ready packed to be shipped by lorries to wherever we were going. And we went to Lyon-Solent, to the airbase at Lyon-Solent, where they were taking all our tools, boxes of tools and stuff like that.
Do you think career affected you?
Well, I think I grew up as a man, really. I learned lots of things in various countries, didn't I? That's the thing I think. I think about serving abroad. You meet other countries and other people, especially when you go ashore.
But what I'm sort of driving at is that you obviously you know, you'd got married and you then left. You then did a year of really hard work.
That's
you
right,
lost,
yeah.
You lost people. People died around you.
Yes.
And you know, how did your wife realise there's been a change? Did it affect you? Did you, you know?
Not really. But you resume. I immediately went to. I got stationed to Leon Solent. I didn't go back on board ship. When you returned from leave, we had to go. You were posted. We weren't going back to the squadron anymore. Each of us had got a new posting. So mine was to the helicopter holding unit at Leon Solent. Now, I had never worked on helicopters, but here I was going to be posted to a helicopter squadron at Leon Solent.
I suppose that concentrates your mind, doesn't it?
Well, immediately you've got to learn different engines, different aircraft, different.
Yeah, but I mean, what I mean is, at least you're not dwelling on the past.
Oh no,
You're focusing on something.
exactly. Yes, yes, and of course my wife then got a married quarter to join me then at that base, and of course we didn't have any children.
How do you feel about being a Korean veteran now, then?
Well, I don't think that's publicised enough. It's one of those. It's like a forgotten war, really. The people that really suffered ashore, they don't. I mean, you see about the Vietnam War, you see about Afghanistan. Nothing about Korea at all. Very, very few programs. Yeah, well, and if you go into the libraries, you've got a hell of a job to turn up a book on Korea. I've only got one there myself, but it just happens that my 821 Squadron engineering officer, Lieutenant Commander Lansdowne, he actually wrote a book about the whole of the fleet arm activities in the Korean War, all of the activities. And he got all the information from the War Department on all the flights, and it's fully documented. It's a wonderful book. Each visit to Korean waters is documented.
Well, I think I'd like to have a look at that. I think I've probably reached the end of your interview there, Frank.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time. It's a lovely interview.
I've really